My grandmother forced my mother to hand me over on my 5th birthday, then used fake letters to make me believe she'd abandoned me. When I finally opened up about the truth, Grandma laughed and said, "Mothers who break tradition don't deserve daughters." I stayed silent. That was 3 years ago. This morning, she was dragged out of court, screaming my name. What was your most horrifying family tradition? My grandmother expected every woman in our family to give up their firstborn daughter to go to finishing school when they were 5 years old, but once it was my turn, I learned what finishing school really meant. Grandma had controlled our family for decades, and the finishing school for firstborn girls was her most treasured tradition. The mothers never saw their daughters again until they turned 18, and returned home strange, quiet, and completely devoted to Grandma. I remember when I was 4, and one of my cousins finally came home. She wouldn't talk about their years away, just said Grandma had taught them well. My aunt cried, overjoyed to see her daughter again, but my cousin just watched Grandma emotionlessly. I was my mother's firstborn daughter, but my mom didn't want to hand me over, so before I turned 5, she tried to run with me. She made it 3 states away before Grandma found us. I don't know what Grandma threatened, but Mom came back defeated. On my 5th birthday, she packed my little suitcase with shaking hands. "I'll see you when you're 18, she whispered, not meeting my eyes. "Be good for Grandma." I screamed for her as Grandma drove me away, but Mom just stood in the driveway, broken. Well, it turned out those 13 years at Grandma's farm weren't school. They were labor camps. She had 12 girls at any time, aged 5 to 18, working her massive farm from dawn to dusk. We weren't learning to be proper women. We were free child labor. We worked the fields, tended animals, cooked, cleaned, and were struck if we slowed down. But that wasn't the worst part. Every night, Grandma would tell us how our mothers had abandoned us, chosen their own comfort over raising us. She'd show us fake letters where our mothers said they were glad we were gone. By the time girls turned 18, they despised the mothers they'd once loved. That's why they returned as strangers. I almost fell for it too. For years, I believed Mom had thrown me away. But when I was 15, I found something that changed everything. Hidden in Grandma's desk were the real letters. Hundreds of them. Letters from mothers begging to see their daughters, promising anything for just one visit. Letters stained with tears, full of love and desperation. Mom had written me every week for 10 years. I started planning that day while I pretended to be the perfect brainwashed granddaughter. When I turned 18 and Grandma finally drove me home, I played my part. I called Mom by her first name, acted cold and distant. I saw her heart break but couldn't risk Grandma suspecting. I had to save the 11 girls still trapped on that farm. For months, I gathered evidence. I took photos during my required visits to Grandma, documenting the young girls working fields in brutal heat. I recorded Grandma's nightly brainwashing sessions. I copied financial records showing she'd been collecting government subsidies for a fake boarding school while using child slaves. When I had enough, I went to Mom and showed her everything. Mom sobbed for hours, holding the letters she'd written me. Together, we went to the police. They raided the farm and found 11 girls, malnourished and exhausted. The youngest, my second cousin, was only 6, already believing her mother had willingly sold her to Grandma. It was heartbreaking watching these girls reunite with mothers they'd been taught to hate. Grandma was arrested, but she'd prepared for this. At her trial, she produced documents signed by every mother, giving her full custody. The mothers swore they'd been forced to sign, but the signatures were real. Grandma's lawyer argued the mothers had willingly given up their daughters and now regretted it, which was sad but evidence of a crime. The case dragged on while Grandma walked free on bail. That's when family members started choosing sides. Half believed Grandma had been saving girls. They testified about how well-behaved the returned daughters were, how successful they'd become. They didn't care that success came from 13 years of unpaid labor and psychological torture. The other half had been in the school themselves and knew the truth but were terrified to speak up. Grandma still had power, still had secrets, still had ways to destroy lives. Mom became the focal point of Grandma's rage. She'd broken the cycle, exposed the system. Grandma's supporters harassed us daily. Dead animals on our doorstep, windows broken, constant threats. We moved 3 times, but they always found us. Mom started drinking and stopped sleeping. She'd saved me but lost everything else, so she attempted to take her own life. I found her in time, but barely. As paramedics worked on her, she grabbed my hand and whispered, "I'm sorry I gave you to her. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop her sooner." She survived but was committed to a psychiatric ward for her own safety. I testified against Grandma while Mom was still hospitalized. I told the court everything about the farm, showed them the evidence, played the recordings. But when I arrived for my daily visit to Mom, the nurses were panicked. Mom's room was empty. Her window was open. Security footage showed 2 women in scrubs wheeling her out on a gurney at 3 a.m., but their faces were hidden. On her pillow was a note in Grandma's handwriting. "A mother who abandons her daughter deserves to learn what real abandonment feels like. Don't worry, I'll teach her properly this time." My hands shook as I realized the truth. Grandma had taken Mom, and this time, there would be no letters, no return date, no promise of reunion. Just my mother, alone with the woman who'd stolen 13 years of my life, who blamed her for exposing everything. The police station was chaos when I arrived. Officers scrambled to coordinate a search while detectives questioned me about the security footage. I showed them the note, watched their faces darken as they realized this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Detective Nellie Saunders took charge of the investigation. She was young but sharp, understanding immediately that Grandma had planned this carefully. The fake nurses, the timing during shift change, the disabled security cameras along certain corridors, everything pointed to inside help. I spent hours at the station, going through photos of hospital staff, trying to identify the women who'd taken Mom. My hands trembled as I flipped through face after face, knowing every minute that passed meant Grandma had Mom longer. The detective kept bringing me coffee, trying to keep me focused, but my mind raced with terrible possibilities. By evening, we'd identified one of the fake nurses. She was actually my second cousin Kat, one of Grandma's most devoted supporters. She'd gone through the school 20 years ago and now worked as Grandma's enforcer, keeping the younger generation in line. The police put out an alert for her, but I knew she'd already gone underground. I left the station as darkness fell, exhausted but unable to rest. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty without Mom's presence. I'd moved back in with her after finding her that terrible morning, wanting to keep her safe. Now her coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, half full and cold. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members. Some offered help, others blamed me for destroying our family traditions. One text from an unknown number simply read, "You should have stayed quiet." I recognized the threat for what it was. Grandma's supporters closing ranks. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at Mom's desk, going through her papers, looking for anything that might help. She'd kept meticulous records during the court case, documenting every threat, every incident of harassment. In a folder marked insurance, I found something unexpected. A list of properties Grandma owned under various shell companies. Most were farms or rural properties, perfect for hiding someone. I mapped them out, noting which ones were isolated enough for Grandma's purposes. There were 12 properties within a day's drive, and checking them all would take time we didn't have. The next morning, I started visiting the family members who'd stayed neutral in the conflict. They were the ones who knew Grandma's patterns but hadn't chosen sides yet. My great-aunt Nellie lived in a modest apartment downtown, keeping her distance from family drama. She let me in reluctantly, checking the hallway before closing the door. Her living room was filled with family photos, including several of girls who'd gone through Grandma's school. She listened as I explained about Mom's kidnapping, her face growing paler with each detail. "I always knew she'd escalate," she finally said. When the trial started, she called all of us who'd been through the school, said we needed to remember our loyalty. She pulled out a notebook, hands shaking slightly. "I've been keeping track of who she contacts and when. Maybe it'll help." The notebook contained contained dates, times, and names, a record of Grandma's network. I recognized many of the names as relatives who'd testified on her behalf, but there were others too, people I didn't know were involved. The web was larger than I'd imagined. My phone rang as I was leaving Nellie's apartment. It was Detective Saunders with news. They'd found Kat's car abandoned at a truck stop 2 hours north. Security footage showed her getting into another vehicle, but the plates were obscured. The trail was already going cold. I drove to the truck stop myself, needing to do something active. The manager let me review the footage after I explained the situation. I watched Kat climb into a dark van, saw her look directly at the camera for just a moment. She knew she was being recorded. She wanted us to know she wasn't hiding. On the drive back, I noticed a car following me. It stayed 3 vehicles behind, matching my speed perfectly. There's something oddly convenient about this grandmother running a child labor farm disguised as finishing school for over a decade without anyone questioning it. I'm curious why none of these mothers ever tried to visit or check on their daughters during those 13 years. When I took an unexpected exit, it followed. My heart pounded as I pulled into a busy shopping center, watching the car cruise past slowly. I couldn't see the driver's face, but I memorized the license plate. Back home, I found my front door slightly open. I'd locked it that morning, I was certain. I called the police before entering, waiting in my car until they arrived. The officers swept through the apartment, finding no one inside, but someone had been there. Mom's room had been searched. Her dresser drawers were pulled out, closet reorganized, papers scattered. They'd taken her journal, the one where she'd documented her feelings during my years away. On her pillow was another note. Stop looking or lose more than just her words. The threat was clear, but it also told me something important. They were worried. If Grandma felt secure in her hiding place, she wouldn't bother with warnings. She was trying to buy time, which meant Mom was still alive and probably still being moved. I called Nellie Saunders, updating her on the break-in. She increased patrols around my building and suggested I stay somewhere else for safety, but I couldn't leave. This was where Mom would look for me if she escaped. This was home. That evening, my cousin Brad called. He'd been one of the few male relatives to speak out against Grandma, despite never experiencing the school himself. His sister had returned from it changed, and he'd spent years trying to understand what happened to her. I heard about your mom, he said. I want to help. My sister finally started talking about her time at the farm. She mentioned other properties, places Grandma would take the older girls sometimes, places that aren't on any official records. We met at a diner outside town, away from potential watchers. Brad brought his sister's journal, filled with fragments of memories she'd recovered through therapy. The entries were heartbreaking. Descriptions of punishment rooms, isolation chambers, places where girls who resisted were reformed. One entry caught my attention. It described a cabin in the mountains, 2 hours from the main farm. Grandma had taken the most resistant girls there for intensive training. The description was vague, but included details about a distinctive red barn and a creek that ran behind the property. I cross-referenced the description with topographical maps, narrowing down possible locations. There were 3 areas that matched, all remote enough to hide someone indefinitely. It wasn't much, but it was more than we'd had before. Brad offered to check one location while I handled another. I wanted to refuse, to keep him safe from Grandma's reach, but I needed help. Time was running out, and Mom's psychiatric medications would only last so long without refills. The thought of her going through withdrawal while captive made me sick. We agreed to go at dawn, before Grandma's network expected movement. I spent the night preparing, flashlight, first aid kit, phone fully charged, pepper spray. I wrote down everything I knew and emailed it to Detective Saunders, just in case something went wrong. Sleep was impossible. I lay in Mom's bed, surrounded by her scent, remembering all the nights she'd held me after nightmares about the farm. She'd been so strong for me, fighting her own trauma while helping me heal. Now it was my turn to be strong for her. As dawn approached, I dressed in dark clothes and hiking boots. The drive to my assigned location took me through winding mountain roads as the sky lightened. I thought about all the mornings at Grandma's farm, waking before sunrise to begin work. She'd stolen so many dawns from me. I wouldn't let her steal any more from Mom. The first location was empty, just an old hunting cabin that hadn't been used in years. I searched thoroughly, looking for any sign of recent activity, but found only dust and decay. 1 location down, 2 to go. I was heading to the second location when Brad called. His voice was tense, excited. He'd found fresh tire tracks at his site, multiple vehicles arriving recently. The red barn from his sister's description was there, exactly as she'd remembered it. Don't go in alone, I warned him. Wait for me or call the police. But cell service was spotty in the mountains. The call dropped before he could respond. I turned my car around, speeding toward his location while trying repeatedly to reconnect. Each failed call increased my panic. The access road to Brad's site was barely visible, just a break in the trees that looked like a deer path. I drove carefully, wincing at every sound my car made. If Grandma had guards posted, they'd hear me coming long before I arrived. I parked a quarter mile from the coordinates and continued on foot. The forest was quiet except for birds beginning their morning songs. Through the trees, I glimpsed the red barn, its paint faded but unmistakable. Brad's car was parked nearby, empty. My heart pounded as I circled the property, staying hidden in the tree line. Besides the barn, there was a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. Someone was definitely here. Several vehicles were parked behind the cabin, including a dark van that could have been the one from the truck stop footage. I was about to call for backup when I heard voices. Moving closer, I recognized Kat's sharp tone. She was arguing with someone, insisting they needed to move locations again. The other voice was older, raspier, one of Grandma's longtime supporters whose name I couldn't place. They mentioned Brad, said he was secured in the barn. My blood ran cold. He'd walked right into their trap, and now I had to decide whether to wait for police or try to help him myself. Every instinct screamed to wait for backup, but I remembered Mom's face that morning I found her, how close I'd come to being too late. I texted Detective Saunders the exact coordinates and situation, then crept toward the barn. The large doors were chained shut, but there was a smaller side entrance. I could hear movement inside, footsteps, muffled voices. As I reached for the door handle, someone grabbed my shoulder. I nearly screamed before recognizing the face. It was Jonathan, another cousin who'd testified against Grandma. He put a finger to his lips, pulling me back into the shadows. There are 4 of them, he whispered. I've been watching since yesterday. He explained he'd been following Kat since she disappeared, hoping she'd lead to Mom. He'd seen them bring someone in during the night, covered in a blanket. Then Brad had arrived this morning and been quickly overpowered. We need to wait for police, he insisted, but I was already forming a plan. If Mom was in that cabin, she needed her medications. Every hour mattered. I convinced Jonathan to create a distraction while I tried to reach the cabin. He reluctantly agreed, moving toward the vehicles. Moments later, a car alarm blared through the morning air. I heard shouting as 2 people ran from the cabin to investigate. It was the opening I needed. I sprinted to the cabin's back door, finding it unlocked in their haste. The interior was sparse. A main room with basic furniture, a small kitchen, 2 closed doors. I tried the first door, finding a storage room filled with supplies. The second door was locked from the outside with a simple bolt. I slid it open, heart racing. Inside, Mom sat on a narrow bed, her wrists zip-tied together. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused from medication withdrawal, but she was alive. She looked up at me with confusion, then recognition, then tears. We have to go, I whispered, using my keys to cut the zip ties. She was weak, unsteady, but determined. I supported her weight as we moved toward the door. We'd made it 3 steps when footsteps pounded on the front porch. There was no time to reach the back door. I pulled Mom into the storage room, closing the door just as someone entered the cabin. We pressed against the wall, barely breathing, as footsteps moved through the main room. She's gone. Kat's voice was shrill with panic. The door was locked. I checked it an hour ago. More footsteps, more voices. They were searching, checking everywhere. The storage storage room door had no lock, nowhere to hide except behind some boxes. Mom gripped my hand, her whole body shaking from withdrawal symptoms. The door opened. I tensed, ready to fight, but it was Jonathan. He gestured urgently for us to follow. The others were searching the woods, assuming Mom had fled outside. We had moments before they realized their mistake. We ran, Mom stumbling but pushing forward with desperate energy. Jonathan led us to his car, hidden further down the access road. As we drove away, I saw police lights approaching from the opposite direction. Detective Saunders had gotten my message. Mom collapsed in the back seat, her breathing labored. I called 911, explaining her condition and medication needs. The dispatcher directed us to the nearest hospital while keeping the line open. Mom squeezed my hand, trying to speak through cracked lips. "You found me," she whispered. "My brave girl found me." The hospital emergency room buzzed with activity as we rushed Mom inside. Medical staff immediately took over, wheeling her away while I filled out paperwork with shaking hands. Jonathan stayed with me, his presence a comfort as I struggled to remember Mom's medication list and medical history. Detective Saunders arrived within minutes, her expression grim as she took my statement. I described finding Mom, the cabin layout, and the people we'd seen. She dispatched units to secure the scene and search for Brad, who was still missing. The weight of leaving him behind pressed on my chest, but I'd had to choose between saving Mom and helping him. Hours passed in the waiting room. Jonathan paced while I sat frozen, replaying the morning's events. A doctor finally emerged, explaining that Mom was stable but severely dehydrated and experiencing withdrawal symptoms. They'd started her back on her medications, but recovery would take time. GPS trackers, scary notes, and break-ins. Grandma's playing detective movie villain while our hero connects dots like she's solving the world's darkest puzzle, one creepy barn at a time. I could see her briefly. Mom lay propped up in the hospital bed, IV lines running into her arms. Her eyes were clearer now, focusing on me as I entered. I took her hand, feeling how thin it had become in just days. She squeezed back weakly, tears sliding down her cheeks. The doctor explained they'd need to keep her for observation, possibly several days. I nodded, understanding but dreading the vulnerability of her being in one place. Grandma had gotten to her in a psychiatric ward. A regular hospital seemed even less secure. I voiced my concerns to Detective Saunders, who arranged for an officer to be posted outside Mom's room. It wasn't foolproof, but it was something. I settled into the chair beside Mom's bed, determined not to leave her alone again. Jonathan left to check on Brad's status, promising to call with updates. I watched Mom sleep, her breathing finally steady and peaceful. My phone vibrated with messages from family members who'd heard about the morning's events. The family divide was shifting, some who'd supported Grandma now questioning their loyalty after learning about Mom's kidnapping. My cousin Rachel called, her voice trembling. She'd been through Grandma's school 15 years ago and had testified on Grandma's behalf out of fear. Now she wanted to help. She had information about other properties, places even the police didn't know about. I met Rachel in the hospital cafeteria, away from Mom's room but close enough to return quickly. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. She pushed a folder across the table, hands shaking. Inside were property deeds, old photographs, and handwritten notes. Rachel explained that Grandma had used some girls as secretaries once they turned 16, having them manage her various holdings. Rachel had copied everything she could before leaving at 18, too scared to use it until now. The documents revealed 5 more properties, all purchased through different shell companies over the decades. One caught my attention, a farmhouse bought the year I was born, isolated but with multiple outbuildings, perfect for hiding people or continuing her school in secret. Detective Saunders joined us, reviewing the documents with growing interest. She immediately began coordinating searches of the properties, but warned it would take time to get warrants for all of them, time we might not have if Grandma decided to run. Jonathan called with mixed news. Police had found Brad locked in the barn, dehydrated but otherwise unharmed. He'd seen Kat and 3 others flee when they heard sirens approaching. The cabin showed signs of hasty evacuation. They'd been planning to move Mom again when I'd found her. Brad was being treated at a different hospital for safety. He'd overheard conversations while captive, learning that Grandma had been planning something bigger than just taking Mom. She'd been recruiting younger family members, promising them power and wealth if they helped restart her school elsewhere. The revelation sickened me. Even facing criminal charges, Grandma was planning to continue her abuse with a new generation of victims. We had to stop her before she disappeared completely, taking vulnerable girls with her. I returned to Mom's room to find her awake and agitated. The nurse explained she'd been asking for me, becoming distressed when I wasn't there. I took her hand, feeling her relax at my touch. The trauma of captivity had left her clingy and fearful, unlike the strong woman who'd raised me. That evening, more family members began reaching out. My cousin Marcus, who'd always seemed neutral, called with a warning. He'd overheard his mother, one of Grandma's strongest supporters, making plans to retrieve the stolen property. They were planning something for tonight. I alerted Detective Saunders and the hospital security. They increased patrols and moved Mom to a more secure wing, but I knew Grandma's supporters were resourceful and desperate. They'd proven they could get past security before. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every footstep in the hallway made me tense. Jonathan returned to help keep watch, bringing Brad with him despite medical advice to rest. We were family members who'd chosen truth over tradition, and we needed to stick together. Around midnight, the fire alarm went off. Hospital staff began evacuating patients, but I recognized the tactic immediately. This was how they'd create chaos to grab Mom. I refused to leave her side as nurses debated protocol. Detective Saunders arrived just as security confirmed it was a false alarm. Someone had pulled the alarm on a different floor, likely trying to draw attention away. She'd brought additional officers, turning Mom's wing into a fortress. Grandma's supporters would have to try harder than that. The night passed slowly. I dozed fitfully in the chair, waking at every sound. Mom slept better with medication, but still stirred often, reaching out to ensure I was there. Dawn brought relief and exhaustion in equal measure. Rachel returned with more information. She'd spent the night going through old photos and remembered something crucial. The farmhouse in the documents had been where Grandma took girls for special training, the ones who resisted the most. If Grandma was planning to restart her operation, that's where she'd go. Detective Saunders coordinated a raid on the farmhouse while maintaining surveillance on the other properties. I wanted to go, to see this through, but she firmly refused. My place was with Mom, keeping her safe while they handled Grandma. The waiting was agony. I paced the hospital room while Mom watched anxiously. She was more alert now, the medication stabilizing her condition. She tried to apologize for being taken, for causing worry, but I wouldn't let her. None of this was her fault. My phone rang with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Grandma's voice filled my ear, calm and controlled as always. She spoke about disappointment, about family loyalty, about how I'd destroyed everything she'd built. I put her on speaker so Detective Saunders could trace the call. Grandma revealed she knew about the raid, had expected it. The farmhouse was empty, had been for years. She was always one step ahead, always planning. She offered a trade, stop pursuing her, and she'd leave the family alone, continue, and more people would suffer. I looked at Mom, saw the fear in her eyes, but also determination. We both knew Grandma's promises were worthless. She'd never stop trying to control our family, never stop viewing girls as property to be molded. I told her we'd see this through to the end. The call ended with Grandma's cold laughter. Detective Saunders' team hadn't been able to trace it. She was using some kind of scrambler, but the call itself was evidence, proof she was still orchestrating everything. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. My Aunt Ashley arrived at the hospital. She'd been one of Grandma's most vocal supporters, testifying about how the school had made her daughter successful. Now she stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter Emma had called her that morning, hysterical. Grandma had approached her about sending her own 5-year-old daughter to a new and improved program. The cycle was starting again, and Ashley finally understood what she'd been supporting. Ashley had information. She'd been part of Grandma's inner circle, privy to plans others weren't. There was a compound being prepared 2 states over, funded by selling off some of the discovered properties. Several families had already committed to sending their daughters. The network was bigger than we'd imagined. Grandma had spent decades building loyalty through fear and manipulation. Even facing prison, she had believers ready to continue her work. Ashley provided names, dates, financial records she'd stolen before fleeing. Detective Saunders expanded the investigation, coordinating with police in other states. The compound Ashley described was real, purchased under yet another shell company. Construction workers had been hired to renovate buildings, told it was for a private boarding school. More family members began defecting from Grandma's side as word spread about the new compound. Parents who'd been convinced the school was beneficial realized their own granddaughters were at risk. The foundation of Grandma's power, family loyalty through tradition, was crumbling, but Grandma wasn't giving up. That evening, Kat appeared in the hospital lobby. Security stopped her before she could reach our floor, but her message was clear. She held up a photo of my youngest cousin, 5-year-old Lily, playing in her backyard. The threat was unmistakable. I called Lily's parents immediately, warning them about the implicit threat. They were already packing to leave town, having received their own warnings. Grandma was getting desperate, making mistakes. Threatening children openly showed she was losing control. Brad had been investigating the financial side while recovering. He discovered Grandma had been moving money rapidly, liquidating assets. She was planning to run, but not alone. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals, enough to transport and establish multiple people. The pieces were falling into place. Grandma wasn't just planning to restart her school. She was creating a network of them. Different states, different names, but the same system of control and abuse. We had to stop her before she scattered her operation too wide to track. Mom was getting stronger, more like herself each day. She insisted on helping, reviewing documents from her bed and making calls to family members. Her voice carried weight. She'd sacrificed everything to save me and the other girls. People listened when she spoke about breaking the cycle. Detective Saunders' team finally got a break. Traffic cameras had caught Kat's van at multiple locations, creating a pattern. Mom suddenly helping from her hospital bed after being drugged and kidnapped. That's quite the recovery speed for someone who was just barely conscious. Ashley's complete change of heart seems awfully convenient too. She goes from Grandma's biggest supporter to stealing financial records overnight. They were using a warehouse district as a staging area, close enough to monitor the hospital, but industrial enough to avoid attention. The raid on the warehouse was planned for dawn. I spent the night with Mom, both of us too anxious to sleep. We talked about the future, about healing, about ensuring no girl would suffer what I and others had endured. Mom held my hand tightly, drawing strength from our connection. As the sun rose, Detective Saunders called with updates. They'd found the warehouse, but it was empty except for evidence of recent occupation. Maps on the walls showed routes to various states, lists of families who'd pledged daughters. They'd missed Grandma by hours, but they'd also found something crucial, a burner phone with one number in its history. The number traced to a motel 2 hours away. Local police were already en route, hoping to catch Grandma before she moved again. The waiting stretched endlessly. Mom and I sat together, joined by Jonathan, Brad, and Rachel. We were the family members who'd chosen truth over tradition, bonds forged through shared trauma and determination to protect others. Finally, the call came. Police had surrounded the motel, finding Grandma and 6 supporters preparing to leave. She'd been caught loading files and cash into vehicles, evidence of her network and plans. But Grandma wasn't going quietly. She'd barricaded herself in a room with 2 young girls, daughters of her supporters, already being groomed for the new schools. The standoff lasted hours while negotiators tried to secure their release. Grandma used them as shields, knowing police wouldn't risk the children. I couldn't stand waiting anymore. Against all advice, I drove to the motel with Jonathan. Maybe Grandma would listen to me, the granddaughter who'd brought down her empire. Maybe I could convince her to let the girls go. Police tried to stop me from approaching, but Detective Saunders understood. She arranged for me to speak to Grandma through a megaphone. I stood in that parking lot, surrounded by police cars and growing media attention, and spoke from my heart. I talked about the letters I'd found, the love our mothers had for us despite Grandma's lies. I described the pain of believing I'd been abandoned, the joy of learning the truth. I asked her to show mercy to these new girls, to break the cycle herself. Grandma's response came through a cracked window. She called me weak, corrupted by my mother's influence. She said the girls with her would be stronger, would understand loyalty and tradition. She'd rather die than see her life's work destroyed. The standoff continued as afternoon turned to evening. Parents of the girls arrived, pleading for their daughter's return. Former victims of the school gathered, sharing their stories with media who'd begun covering the situation. The truth Grandma had hidden for decades was finally being exposed. One of Grandma's supporters inside cracked first. She opened a window and pushed one of the girls out, screaming that she couldn't do this anymore. Police grabbed the child while the supporter was pulled back inside. One safe, one still trapped. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My elderly great-uncle, Grandma's brother, arrived at the scene. He'd been estranged from the family for decades, but the news had reached him. He asked to speak to Grandma directly. Their conversation was private, but whatever he said worked. An hour later, Grandma released the second girl. She emerged from the motel room with her hands raised, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen her. The empire she'd built on fear and control had finally fallen. As police took Grandma into custody, she looked directly at me. There was no remorse in her eyes, only cold fury. She blamed me for destroying generations of tradition, for weakening our family. I felt no guilt. I'd saved future generations from her abuse. The aftermath was chaotic. 6 supporters were arrested along with Grandma, while others fled before police could arrive. Documents seized revealed the full scope of her network. Dozens of families across multiple states who'd bought into her vision of proper child rearing. Mom was released from the hospital the next day, finally safe from Grandma's reach. We returned to our apartment to find it filled with flowers and cards from family members who'd been too afraid to speak out before. The healing could finally begin, but the work wasn't over. Other properties needed to be searched, other victims identified and helped. The legal case would take months or years to fully prosecute. Some family members still believed in Grandma's methods, going underground to continue her work. I spent the following weeks helping Detective Saunders build the case. Every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as tradition. Grandma had perfected her system over decades, but we were finally tearing it down. More survivors came forward, sharing their stories of the school and its lasting effects. Support groups formed, helping women reconnect with the mothers they'd been taught to hate. The healing was slow and painful, but it was happening. Brad discovered the financial extent of Grandma's operation. She'd amassed millions through unpaid labor and government fraud. The money would be seized, hopefully distributed to her victims as compensation for stolen childhoods. Mom grew stronger each day, though nightmares still plagued her sleep. We attended therapy together, working through the trauma of separation and reunion. Our bond, tested by Grandma's cruelty, had survived and strengthened. The preliminary hearing approached with mounting tension. Grandma had hired expensive lawyers, still commanding loyalty from some family members who funded her defense. She planned to fight every charge, claim every signature was voluntary. Every mother had chosen to give up their daughter, but we had truth on our side. The letters, the financial records, the testimony of dozens of survivors. The girl I'd helped escape, now in her 20s, flew in from across the country to testify. Others who'd been too scared before found courage in numbers. The night before the hearing, I received a final message from Grandma Grandma through her lawyer. She offered to plead guilty to lesser charges if I agreed to speak on her behalf, to say the school had good intentions despite poor execution. The manipulation continued even from jail. I refused, of course. No plea deal could undo the damage she'd caused or prevent others from following her example. She needed to face full consequences, to have her crimes exposed completely. Only then could our family truly heal. That morning, I helped Mom get ready for court. She insisted on attending, on facing the woman who tormented our family for so long. Her hands shook as she buttoned her jacket, but her voice was steady when she said she was ready. The courthouse was packed with family members, media, and curious strangers. Grandma entered in shackles, looking smaller in her orange jumpsuit but still radiating cold authority. She surveyed the room like a queen reviewing subjects, showing no hint of remorse. As the charges were read, kidnapping, child endangerment, fraud, conspiracy, I held Mom's hand tightly. Each count represented years of suffering, families torn apart, childhoods stolen. The full weight of Grandma's crimes was finally being acknowledged. When asked to enter a plea, Grandma stood tall and declared, "Not guilty," in a clear voice. She would fight to the end, force every victim to relive their trauma through testimony. It was her final act of control, making us suffer to see justice done. The hearing lasted 3 grueling hours. I watched Grandma's lawyer present document after document, each one technically legal, but obtained through manipulation and fear. The prosecutor countered with our evidence, but Grandma maintained her composure throughout, occasionally glancing at me with calculating eyes. During a recess, I noticed several of Grandma's supporters huddled together near the exit. Their whispered conversation stopped when I approached the water fountain, but I caught fragments about contingency plans and safe houses. Even facing serious charges, they were still organizing. Mom stayed strong through the testimony, though her hands trembled when the prosecutor described her kidnapping. Jonathan and Brad flanked us, creating a protective barrier against the hostile stares from Grandma's faction. Rachel sat 2 rows behind, her presence a silent show of support. The judge set a trial date 6 months away, denying the prosecutor's request for immediate imprisonment. Grandma's lawyers had argued successfully that she posed no flight risk, pointing to her deep community ties and property holdings. She walked out on bail, surrounded by supporters who treated her like a returning hero. Outside the courthouse, I helped Mom navigate through the crowd. Someone shoved past us roughly, hissing accusations about destroying family values. Another relative I barely recognized spat at our feet. The divide in our family had become a chasm, and Grandma's arrest had only widened it. That night, we discovered our apartment door ajar again. This time, nothing was missing, but everything had been slightly moved. Pictures tilted, furniture shifted inches from their usual spots. Mom's medications rearranged in the cabinet. The message was clear. They could reach us anytime they wanted. I installed new locks and a security system, but we both knew these were just gestures. Grandma's network had resources and determination. They'd proven they could access hospitals and homes alike. Mom barely slept, jumping at every sound in the night. 3 days later, Ashley called with urgent news. She'd maintained contact with some of Grandma's inner circle, pretending to still support the cause. They were planning to move forward with the compound, using Grandma's arrest as proof that the government wanted to destroy traditional family values. Police standoffs with kids as shields? Grandma just went from running a weird school to starring in her own crime show finale. Guest tradition includes taking hostages now. The compound was nearly ready. Ashley had seen invoices for bunk beds, industrial kitchen equipment, and educational supplies. Everything needed to house and train dozens of girls. The first families were scheduled to arrive within weeks, believing they were enrolling their daughters in an exclusive program. Detective Saunders coordinated with federal authorities, but jurisdiction issues complicated everything. The compound crossed state lines, the shell companies were registered in different states, and Grandma's lawyers were already filing injunctions against any investigation. Legal channels would take months we didn't have. I spent sleepless nights researching, mapping connections between Grandma's supporters and the new compound. Mom helped when her strength allowed, her insight invaluable after years of documenting Grandma's methods. Together we identified the key players keeping the operation alive. My cousin Marcus visited unexpectedly one evening. He'd been walking a tightrope between both sides of the family, but his mother's increasing extremism had pushed him to choose. He brought financial records showing how supporters were funneling money to the compound through donations to a fake charity. The charity was registered as an educational foundation for underprivileged girls. On paper, it looked legitimate. In reality, it was the funding mechanism for Grandma's expanded operation. Marcus's mother was the treasurer, moving money with the same efficiency she'd learned at Grandma's farm. We needed more than financial records. We needed proof of intent, evidence that would shut down the compound before any girls arrived. Rachel suggested infiltrating one of their planning meetings, but the risk was too high. They knew our faces, our positions. Then Jonathan had an idea. His sister had stayed neutral in the family conflict, maintaining relationships with both sides. She might be able to attend a meeting without raising suspicion. It was dangerous, but she agreed after hearing about the compound's true purpose. The meeting was held at a supporter's home 2 hours away. Jonathan's sister wore a wire provided by Detective Saunders, though we all knew the legal admissibility would be questionable. We waited in a van down the street, listening to static and muffled voices. The conversation was chilling. They discussed curriculum that included 10-hour workdays, isolation punishments for difficult girls, and systematic breaking of family bonds. They'd learned from Grandma's mistakes, planning better documentation to avoid fraud charges while maintaining complete control. Grandma herself called into the meeting from jail, her voice crackling through speakerphone. She gave detailed instructions about psychological manipulation techniques, emphasizing the importance of starting young when girls were most impressionable. Her supporters took notes like devoted students. When Jonathan's sister emerged 2 hours later, she was shaking. The wire had captured everything, including names of 8 families planning to send daughters in the first wave. Some were relatives we knew, others were strangers drawn in by promises of raising proper women. Detective Saunders used the recording to get emergency warrants, but Grandma's lawyers were faster. By the time police arrived at the compound, anything incriminating had been removed. The buildings were empty shells, the supporters claiming they were planning a legitimate boarding school. The setback was crushing, but it revealed something important. Someone inside law enforcement was feeding information to Grandma's network. Every move we made was countered before we could act. The corruption ran deeper than we'd imagined. Mom's health deteriorated under the constant stress. Her medications helped with the psychiatric symptoms, but the physical toll was mounting. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. I caught her staring at nothing sometimes, lost in memories of captivity. 2 weeks before the compound's planned opening, we got unexpected help. Emma, Ashley's daughter, who'd been approached about enrolling her own child, had been doing her own investigation. She'd pretended interest to get inside information, documenting everything with hidden cameras. Her footage showed the dormitories with bars on windows, the punishment rooms disguised as storage areas, the industrial kitchen designed to be run by child labor. Most damning was video of Grandma's supporters discussing how to process the incoming girls, using terms like breaking period and resistance management. Emma had also recorded conversations about their legal strategy. They knew the compound would eventually be discovered, but they planned to scatter before that happened. Multiple sites were being prepared across the country, each designed to operate independently. Grandma was creating a franchise system of abuse. We compiled everything: financial records, wire recordings, video footage, witness testimonies. Detective Saunders worked around the clock building cases that could stick despite the legal obstacles, but time was running out. Families were already traveling toward the compound. I made a desperate decision. If legal channels couldn't stop them in time, maybe public pressure could. I created anonymous social media accounts and began sharing evidence of the compound's true nature. The posts spread quickly among local parenting groups, sparking outrage and concern. Within hours, 3 families canceled their plans to enroll daughters. Phone calls flooded the compound's official number, demanding answers. Grandma's supporters scrambled to control the narrative, claiming the posts were lies spread by bitter family members. But the damage was done. Media outlets picked up the story, though I was careful to keep our identities hidden. Reporters began investigating the educational foundation, finding discrepancies that supported our claims. The compound's opening was postponed indefinitely as scrutiny mounted. Grandma was furious. Her jail calls to supporters became increasingly erratic, demanding they find and silence whoever was spreading information. Her network began turning paranoid, suspecting each other of leaks. The unity she'd built through fear was cracking under pressure. Mom and I moved to a hotel for safety after finding our apartment's security system mysteriously offline one morning. We lived out of suitcases, changing locations every few days. The constant upheaval exhausted Mom, but staying in one place felt too dangerous. Then came an unexpected breakthrough. One of Grandma's most loyal supporters, my aunt who'd served as the charity treasurer, was arrested for embezzlement at her regular job. Facing prison time, she offered to testify about the compound in exchange for leniency. Her lawyer contacted Detective Saunders directly. Her testimony was comprehensive. She detailed how Grandma had run the original farm, how the psychological manipulation worked, how they'd planned to expand the operation. She provided names, dates, financial trails that prosecutors had been struggling to piece together. Most importantly, she revealed the locations of 3 other compounds in various stages of preparation. Each site was registered under different shell companies, funded through separate channels, but all connected to Grandma's core network. The scope was staggering. Coordinated raids shut down all 4 compounds simultaneously. Police found detailed operational plans, lists of enrolled families, and equipment designed for controlling children. Several supporters were arrested, though many fled before authorities arrived. The network was collapsing, but not without casualties. Mom received a final letter from Grandma, somehow smuggled out of jail. It blamed her for destroying generations of tradition, for weakening our family bloodline. The vitriol was intense, but between the lines I saw something else. Fear. Grandma knew her empire was truly ending. The trial began with Grandma firing her expensive lawyers and choosing to represent herself. She turned the courtroom into her stage, lecturing about family values and traditional child rearing. But the evidence was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor testified about their experiences at the farm. I testified for 6 hours, detailing my years of forced labor, the psychological torture, the systematic destruction of family bonds. Mom watched from the gallery, her presence giving me strength. Even Grandma's attempts to discredit me fell flat against the documentation I'd preserved. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, child endangerment, forced labor, fraud, conspiracy. Well, that's my cue to tip the hat and exit stage left. Appreciate you letting me tag along and drop my 2 cents. Stay sharp out there, friends. Subscribe for more content like this.